Hi students, this is Mr. Eckert. We're going to go through target E1, which says that you should be able to describe the history of our understanding of evolution, including the significance of the works of some scientists by the name of Lyell, Hutton, Lamarck, Wallace, Darwin, and Stephen Gould. So we're going to start out with James Hutton, who you can see was a Scottish farmer. And he believed, as he looked around him and saw different things happening in nature, that the earth was going through very small changes, that over time those small changes could add up to big changes. And because of that, he argued that the earth was actually very old, much older than most people in his day believed. Most people in his day believed that it was only several thousands of years old. But when he looked around and saw, like the process of erosion, for example, that would wear on rocks in a river, and the rocks might have started out being sharp and angular, and over time they became smooth and rounded. So that would be an example of something that he saw that was a small change, that over time now he, kind of extrapolated that and could see how the rocks could wear down and wear away, and all those sediments would be deposited as the water carried them downstream and might produce huge sandbanks, and then be carried to the ocean, and where you saw these big beaches of sand. So that was part of some of the examples that he saw that he thought led to an age of the earth being relatively old rather than what most people thought. So again, here's what I was just talking about. Rain or water that's flowing in a river or a stream can cause erosion of not just rocks but actual mountains themselves. As the rain falls on mountains and the wind, it eventually wears those rocks down, and those sediments then are deposited downstream, and through plate tectonics, earthquakes, those can be lifted up into forming new mountains, and the whole process can start all over again. So those are, again, some of the gradual changes that he saw. So another scientist that lived about the same time was Charles Lyell, and he, as you can see, started out as studying law, but then turned into a geologist. And he and Hutton kind of believed pretty much the same thing, that these gradual changes could produce large changes over long periods of time, and that the earth was actually much, much older than most people in their day believed. So he came up with a theory called uniformitarianism, or a belief. Now you can see that the word uniform is in there, and if something is uniform, it stays pretty much the same, right? So this theory says that there are slow changes that happen in the layers of the earth, the crust, and that those are a result of natural forces. So, and the other part of this belief, uniformitarianism, that stays the same, he advocated that the processes that we see happening on Earth now, the natural processes like the movement of the plates and earthquakes and the way volcanoes work and the way erosion works, that those processes have stayed the same all throughout Earth's time. So even if we go backwards in time before people were even around, those same processes worked the same way. And that's basically what uniformitarianism has as its core belief. So then there's this guy, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he came up with a theory. You should be very familiar, or come to be very familiar with his theory, that explained, because his theory directly explained how species changed over time. So his theory goes by a couple different names. One is the theory of acquired characteristics. His theory has, of course, since been discredited, but at the time, many people believed in his theory, which was basically that characteristics can be acquired throughout an organism's lifetime and then passed down to his to their offspring. Keyword is that they are acquired during the organism's lifetime and then passed down. So, in other words, things that happen to you during your life will then, that cause changes in you, will be passed on to your children. The other part of his theory, or the other name I should say for his theory, is the theory of use and disuse, and that went along with the idea that as you use traits more, they become bigger. If you don't use traits that you have as often, they will actually become smaller. So that's the use and disuse part of his theory. So use the trait a lot, and it gets bigger. Don't use a lot, and it gets smaller. So there are obviously parts of this that make sense, otherwise nobody would have believed it way back then. You can acquire certain diseases during your lifetime, such as AIDS, and you can pass those on to your offspring, right? And then, if you use your muscles a lot, then they're going to get bigger. And if you don't use your muscles a lot, if you've ever had a leg or an arm in a cast, you know that after you get the cast off, you can see a physical difference in the size of that arm or leg compared to your other one, that your muscles actually atrophy and do get smaller. But in some ways, of course, it doesn't make sense. If you accidentally cut your finger off during your lifetime, then your children aren't going to be born missing that finger. And if you do decide to become a bodybuilder and work out and really bulk up, your children aren't going to be born with being very muscular. The use and disuse part, if you don't use your left arm or a limb for a period of time, that limb doesn't actually shrink and get smaller and smaller and smaller until it's just a little teeny tiny, appendage. And of course we use our eyes and our mouth and our nose and our ears all the time, but they don't get bigger throughout your life. Now you might say, well, I've read that your nose does and your ears, they never stop growing, and that's actually true. But there's a limit to their growth, and the point here being the use of those is not what makes them get bigger. So a famous example that is used in many biology books to explain Lamarck's theory deals with giraffes, and it starts out saying that long ago giraffes had short necks, very short compared to what they are now. And of course, as you know, giraffes eat leaves. They're herbivores, and they eat leaves on trees. So they're eating the leaves, and they run out of the leaves on the lower limbs, and so they have to stretch to reach the leaves at the top of the tree. So as they stretched their necks out, they actually made their necks a little longer, and not a lot longer, but just a little bit. And you might say, well, this isn't really possible. That's silly. But you may remember seeing photographs or maybe even a video of there's tribes in Africa that actually put metal rings around the necks of little girls, and they keep on adding these metal rings, stretch their necks out until their necks are actually quite long, to the point where if they took the rings away, they can't even support their head any longer because their necks are so long and flimsy. So, it's possible that this could happen. So the key here is Lamarck believed that once they stretched their necks out a little bit, when they had baby giraffes, they were automatically born with necks that were a little bit longer. And then, of course, the same process would occur. Those giraffes ate leaves on the bottom branches, and those ran out, and so they had to stretch their necks to reach the leaves on the top, and they made their necks a little bit longer. And this kept on happening after generation until we get the giraffes that we have today. Well, Charles Darwin, he came up with a different idea that is still supported today with evidence, and that's the theory of natural selection. You'll remember, hopefully, that a scientific theory is an explanation of how something happens, whereas a scientific law is just a description. So the evolution law would say that living things, species and populations, they change over time. So how do they do that? Well, Charles Darwin came up with this explanation of how that would work called the theory of natural selection. So we're going to go into this in more detail in another target, but basically it has 4 parts. There's 4 parts four basic parts to his theory of natural selection. One is that all living things show genetic variation. No two individuals of sexually reproducing organisms are exactly alike. And you might say, well, what about identical twins? But if you know any identical twins, then even they, are not identical down to the last little freckle, right? So there's genetic variation in all sexually reproducing organisms. All living things tend to produce more offspring than the ecosystem can support. So they overpopulate, they overproduce. Because of that, it leads to the next point, which is a struggle for existence. So there's not enough food, there's not enough water and resources to go around for all of these offspring, so they have to compete with each other. I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase survival of the fittest. And then the last part is that not all the organisms are going to survive. Differential survival means just that. Not all of them live. Only those that are best adapted to that particular ecosystem survive. So they survive, and this is the key part, they survive to reproduce. If they don't reproduce, then it's kind of their survival is almost pointless from an evolutionary standpoint. So they survive. When they reproduce, they pass on those traits that gave them an advantage to begin with to their offspring. So what about this guy Alfred Wallace? Well, he came up with ideas very similar to Charles Darwin, lived about the same time, and they did very similar research, but Wallace didn't have his work published by the science community at that time, the Linnean Society. They looked at Wallace's work and Darwin's work, and they concluded that Darwin had a lot more research and data to back up his theory, so they credited him with being the father of biological evolution and gave him the credit for this theory of natural selection. So as it says here, later Wallace kind of diverged from natural selection, that belief, and turned more to a creationist or spiritualist belief. The last scientist, and this obviously you can see by his picture on Newsweek, is a much more recent scientist, although he did die in 2002, is Stephen Gould. And he's an evolutionary biologist and studied ancient life, paleontologist. He developed a theory called punctuated equilibrium. We're going to look at that again, but basically he believed that most scientists, evolutionary scientists, believe that living things changed over extremely long periods of time. And his theory said that yes, that absolutely happens. Evolution happens very slow, usually, but there are instances where it can happen relatively quickly. And again, we're talking geologic time here, so we're talking maybe hundreds of thousands of years. Or tens of thousands of years rather than millions of years. So that was his idea. Punctuated equilibrium was the idea that sometimes certain species can change relatively quickly in geologic time. So that's it for that target. If you have any questions, please make sure you ask.